areas have changed
Sure.
over that time.
Possible explanation.
Now, how to express this in a taxonomic sequence is another phenomenon. I don't know how to.
Well, is it useful to think of these in terms of grades and forms of industries? This is what I mentioned in that little pamphlet I gave you a while ago. It's useful, I think, for rather imprecise purposes. For example, I think of several of the industries with blades and bladelets as being on the same grade. For example, the two with K12 and K13, which we were talking about yesterday, but varying, having a certain amount of diversity in form. Now, when you get, of course, to the things like the Halfan and the civilian, these two fall into a different grade. This is the furthest. I got hung up also, like you, past the industry level, and I devised this for purely personal reasons, partly to keep them apart in my own mind, and partly to see if exploring this idea, something better would come out of it.
It seems at this level, what you've done, what we ended up doing, what I think has been done in the Near East, is that this higher level seems to come to very general technological characteristics.
Mm-hmm.
General blade technology as opposed to general flake technology. I'm not sure that that's very, it's true, but I'm not sure how useful it is.
Well, as I said, this
or
partly depends on
microlithic
whether you're on the
industries.
inside. It may not be very useful from inside North Africa because you're more
Well,
interested
for
in the diversity.
conceptualizing.
Yes, this is it. This is it
Yes.
exactly. When I was working in Nubia, this didn't seem important to me.
Yeah.
When I moved outside Nubia and began to look at it from the exterior, then it struck me that this is a relatively useful heuristic device.
What does Leroy Gourand, I've forgotten the word he used, but he has suggested for the Upper Paleolithic in Europe a set of terms for things which at least tend to have common correlate in their typological components. And like the orignation, the things which have traditionally been called orignation. And he suggested a group word for this, and I've forgotten what it is.
Remember.
But it's something on the sort of lines of expression.
I would agree with your view that these things from north of Aswan do share a great many more resemblances to the North African scene than the things just south of the first cataract. But I am concerned about the emphasis that we're putting upon one aspect of technology.
Is it not perhaps that it is at this stage that one should start to introduce the socio-cultural side of the sites, the settlements and so on? One can't get any further from the point of view of pure taxonomy of the lithic assemblages themselves, and one is only going to be able to define larger units on the basis of what the settlements were like, what the behavior was, what the economy was, which is based upon interpretations over of many sites. This is taking it into a different realm altogether from what we've been talking about on the taxonomic side of things.
We have models
But
for
it may
doing
well
that.
be that this is the only way that one is going to be able to
been done in the
define
past.
a larger unit.
It's been done, for example, in Middle America, Peruvian area, the whole
Tradition,
co-tradition. It's been done in the Middle East by Braidlitzer's models. My own feeling is that all these things are just abject failures. They are so general and useless as to be,
True.
How do you understand the Middle Ages by calling it dark? I mean, it has no significance at all. And I think that you have to have something that is, if you're going to use these methods, this is what I would argue. If you're going to use these methods to deal with assemblages and up to industry and so on, then you need to use, in some measure or other, comparable kinds of criteria to reach a higher level. I think so. Otherwise, you've shifted from apples and peaches, and you're now beginning to deal with acorns or something, and it's not at all relevant any longer. also you keep yourself relatively conservative so far as being inferential is concerned. And that is probably healthy to do. You could then have another system, in fact, starting at the very bottom, where you would move, 3 degrees of inference over, and you'd start a whole new track of logic, which would be progressively removed from this sort of measurable, repetitive, etc. It'd be more inferential, imaginative, etc.
I think we should distinguish between measurable and measured. Because for argument's sake, if we took
Measurable, I think is what I meant.
a wide selection of not late Pleistocene North African industries, and we took a similar large selection of late Pleistocene sub-Saharan industries, and we mixed all the trays up, not the contents of the trays, but the trays in a room, and we invited a group of American archaeologists to come and look at this and divide these into groups. Before you knew where you were, you'd have your trays sorted out again for you. So that the fact that we may not be measuring the similarity, but if people are able to perceive it in that sort of way, there almost certainly is something measurable if you only find out what to measure. I agree with you. I'm myself uncertain about whether we really need a taxonomic level at this level, whether it has any practical value or whether you don't just talk about it. But this is really important.
Isn't one of the things that's involved here is, do these things really have any social, let's go a little generalized here, is this likely to have any social or cultural significance, these things beyond the industry level?
Surely we think they must.
Well, do we, or do we mean that we think they have a culture, historic?
They have something to
Meaning
do
that
with
that is
human
that they have to
behavior.
do with the fact
That's
that
for
these
sure.
are strands of cultural development which have had more, in which there's been more interaction amongst,
Then,
preferentially vis-a-vis amongst all these than between these and say sub-Saharan Africa. And I think this is probably what we do mean.
Yeah.
Well, what we suspect gives rise to this divergence, and this gross divergence in morphology.
Was it a long night last night? Shall we quit? Why don't we quit? We got dinner at 7:30 and give everybody a chance to look at another wall.
Knew of my particular interest in field strategies. That caught me by surprise. I'm of course interested in them. I just presume all of us are interested in them. So, when I was regarded as more so than anyone else.
I think you've written something about it.
Most of us just go out and do it.
Well, anyway, in going over the agenda that was sent out, I perhaps somewhat overestimated the amount of the discussions that were going to be directed towards this matter of the cultural stratigraphic units, subdivisions, and rather oriented the questions I suggested along that line. Well, I don't really intend to stick to that. I think anything under the, it's just as general subject to field strategies is all right. Actually, I've tried to keep it into fairly specific kinds of areas. As I say, I'm sure we've all deal with routine kinds of things. As Frank Hole's written, along with Heitcher's written a whole book on this kind of thing. So I don't think there's any point in discussing that kind of thing. I would suggest any of the kinds of matters that I mentioned here, or anything else that one wants to talk about. One thing, possibly to start things off with, I heard several remarks during the sessions and in private conversations about the utility of certain kinds of assemblages. In here this morning, last night, we were discussing something, and he was quite willing, for instance, to write the, in quotes, Nanyuki, and this was an old early lot of material found by Leakey in Kenya. Later referred to a Kenya forest myth or something like that, but he just said that could be written off completely. Well, I would presume the frame he was thinking of was in terms of cultural stratigraphic units, but surely there are some kinds of information to be derived there if one is looking for, I don't mean the Nanukian or this Kenia necessarily, but there are some kind of units surely that would not be suitable for constructing cultural stratigraphic units that are still going to give one some kind of information concerning some kind of paleo-environmental circumstances, for example. And I think maybe this kind of thing could be considered. Well, the floor is open.
One of the things that was apparent to us after the fact, not before the fact, is that our field strategy in Nubia had a good deal to do with the way we've looked at the results of the project. And it had something to do with the fact that the classificatory scheme that came out of the Nubian campaign, and I'm not sure that this is so obvious to everyone. Perhaps it might be worthwhile just mentioning. We've, of course, was a salvage project. It was a salvage project in which we had an area over 300 miles in length and someplace 60 miles in width to deal with. And we went at it. It was perfectly obvious from some of the people that we had involved in our project on our particular expedition that some people were quite content to go find a spot and do the whole seasons of several years' work at that spot. And this has certain utility to it, and you can identify those people that did that sort of thing, in our work. And there were others who, and I say that I probably was had an influential position in this, viewed that we had the whole area to deal with, and not just one spot within that area. This we call, it has, I think this is because of the salvage obligation, the salvage responsibility. But we termed this, for lack of something else, as area archaeology. And I noticed Garth was describing essentially the same thing in perhaps not a salvage context. This doesn't mean that other people don't do this. But the fact that we went in and looked at a fairly extensive area and tried to get as many sites as possible, tried to get samples from all the different types of paleoecological situations, all of the different kinds of assemblages, or what we later termed industries, out of here, had something to do with the way we structured the results that we found. This is in contrast to research design, which has also been expressed. Why don't you go and find a good cave and really get this thing straightened out? I think there's a point of some difference of goals in situations like that. Now, since we have left Nubia and worked both upstream and downstream, we're utilizing the same field strategy without the imposition there of salvage or responsibilities of the salvage archaeological method. And this might be a point of some discussion or collaboration.
Fred, could you tell us something about the geological chances of finding even rock shelters in the area that you are working? Is there just a physical possibility that you could find shelter deposits?
Well, there were outside the reservoir limits, for example, in Nubia. There were some small rock shelters that had Neolithic and some late Permian. In fact, there was a little small overhang type thing that was excavated before the Nubian campaign began by, well, I can't remember the man's name now. Who was that? Myers, by Myers. In Egypt, in Egypt, and I don't know the other areas, but in Egypt, we have gone with the Bedouin groups that have worked that are my labor pool and examined all of the caves that are known along this whole escarpment. None of them have any signs of any occupation in them. They're not very numerous. the,
It's also been my experience. They always seem to be swept clean because they're, in any case, not very high and keep their thing animals in there. So always seem to be putting everything outside and there's just nothing in it.
Yeah.
Except a little bit of subbreeze and sheep down.
Except for that one little place that Catfish Cave.
Yeah, well, I was just to mention that.
okay, yeah.
That is a sort of an overhang shelter in Nubian sandstone that went from Cologne dugout with the Yale group. And I think it has radiocarbonates about 6,500, and these are relatively unique harpoons, it seems, talking to Joel Shiner about. And there are some A-group shelters. One that was dug by the Austrians, Sayala, in Libya, and another one dug by Harry Smith, which was, I think, also A-group up through C-group or something like that.
So these things just are yielding nothing relevant to
Not really,
Paleolithic
no.
studies at all?
Well, I wouldn't avoid, if again, if I were making a research design sort of thing, I wouldn't avoid a cave, found one. But I'm not particularly interested in saying that a cave would be my highest priority spot to work. I think this might be something we could discuss, because caves offer certain disadvantages. They offer certain advantages, and those things build in disadvantages. The disadvantage from our point of view is that we like to find these small concentrations that are not repeatedly reutilized by different groups over long periods of time, which caves have a disadvantage of being. And this will provide us with a better view of what the tool inventory of that group at a limited period of time is likely to be than any cave. I don't care how carefully it's excavated.
Presumably the older caves have all disappeared as a result of the retreat of the scarps. Would it be possible, do you think, that some of these Mousterian sites could in fact represent old cave accumulations?
Well, there's some very peculiar artifacts. None of these sites that we've described, I think, could possibly have been, but in Egypt along the escarpments, the Eocene escarpments, there are some very peculiar artifact things which might be have been dropped out of old caves. These buried in travertines, but I have never found a place that I could have reasonable assurance would have been.
Especially there's one occurrence when I walked from Deir el-Bahri over, pardon me, from the Valley of the Kings over to Deir el-Bahri, up on the Jebel and then down. There's lots of Mousterian points that are on there from a, looked like there was an overhang and they'd gone down. Now, whether it was really a rock shelter or not, that one couldn't say. The artifacts were both fresh and burnished black, so they've been exposed an awful long time. It's the only instance that I can think of.
If one were to find a shelter there, something with deep stratigraphy, I wonder from the standpoint of field strategies, just what would one do with it? I think of something one of the students was telling me that rather disturbed me, how someone working with Digitized had evidently spent an entire field season excavating 1 square meter down of, how much was it, 10, 20 centimeters, something like that. Yeah. Where the kind of information that one gets from that sort of thing, for that very detailed kind of careful excavation that would be pertinent to plotting out pattern distributions, having to do something with activity, is, I think, irrelevant in a case like that. It seems to me that one is misdirecting a great deal of energy and is misinterpreting the value of such a deposit.
Why do you say that?
Yeah.
That makes no sense to me.
How many activities can you crowd into a 1 meter square?
No, I don't think that's the point at all.
Seems to me the point is
if you look at what de Lumley can do with a place like Terra Amata, or the other cave that he's dug in on the coast of France. Yeah.
well, if you're excavating the entire floor, but if you're taking a deep sounding down, the virtue of a sequence light archaeal surely is it's giving you an excellent stratigraphic continuum. And it seems to me, unless you are in a position to completely excavate the whole thing,
That's where I think the misunderstanding took place, because I was at this same situation this summer. And there was not just one student excavating 1 meter
They are
square.
taking the whole,
There's one whole section that's being excavated.
mhm. Well,
And one whole side of the cave is being taken down in this very particularistic manner, so that any activity
yeah, okay, then I'll
could be
regard
taken into
Sark Keel,
consideration.
right, as,
And the reason that
It's
this
not
was being
appropriate, but-
done, because the previous work had not done anything like this. There was just, you know, they were making these soundings and that you were
Yeah,
speaking of.
right.
We all know what
This
they
is to
said
give
about
some different
Sark.
information from Sark.
What do you think if you found a shelter in the Nile, though, this way? In view of the fact that you do have this excellent kind of information from these open sites, would it really be worthwhile to pursue that kind of excavation? I think when, it seems to me the main value of such a situation would be to give a stratigraphic continuum to tie in sites. Of
Well, I
course, when
think
you have a
that-
lot of carbon-14 data, it makes that a little bit.
Well, you know, when you make a statement like this, what you're saying is that, in effect, perhaps you would find a site like this in the Nile, and if you did, it would be a unique site, or nearly unique. And so you go in and make a big stratigraphic sounding in it. And what you're saying, in effect, is that nobody can ever do anything more with that site than you are doing by this field methodology. Because when you do that stratigraphic sounding, you are destroying material. And I don't know, I was raised in a very simple field methods tradition. And that is, you're carrying out a successful excavation if you can take the site apart in such a way you can put it all back together again, so that the information is still there for somebody else to do some study that you haven't yet got a real notion of. And I can't see endorsing the fact that you can take, what would you get out of this stratigraphic sounding? At best, you'd get a reinforcement of the sequence that had been built up in the open sites.
Well, that's of course a moot question.
You've done that.
Well, all right.
If you can
I
get a
say,
sample out of
all right,
narrow
at best you
square.
get this. And certainly these sites are going to give different kinds of occupation than the open sites.
Well,
Different
it seems to me
concentration
that
of
what you
material.
say is not mutually exclusive, and it still seems to me that what you would in fact do is, first of all, test it. You can call that anything you want, but that's a sounding. And second, you would then decide on the basis of testing it, because otherwise you don't know what the hell you're going to do with it. Probably excavate it, in part. You never excavate at all if it's of any size, because you'd leave some more for the future.
Well, it's a
On
question
general
of, it's a
principle, unless
question
it's
of
gonna
how
be
you,
flooded. If
it's
it's
a
gonna be
question
flooded,
of
it's
how
another
you
story.
test it.
Right. Well, let's assume that you test it in a capable fashion, so that you do have good control, and of probably in several places you would test it. You test it into it and across it in some way, so that you can get samples so that you have some lateral and some horizontal, some vertical sort of situation. And then you do whatever that seemed to suggest on, but you wouldn't just start at the top or whatever it is and take it apart. This would seem to me quite
No, you
unwise.
certainly can't take the whole thing down
Quite unwise.
level by level that carefully. But
Well, there's another point. I think that we ought to look at these caves. Let's take this hypothetical situation, whatever the field situation. We want to look at the caves. I wouldn't avoid them. I wouldn't brace them as the most important part, but I would not avoid them.
Well, I
Because
just
they may
took-
give us new activity.
Right.
Data.
Actually, I was just taking that as an example that happened to come up of a more general question. Does one use the same kind of excavation techniques for all kinds of occurrences that you come up against? And I'd be inclined to say no, because I'm having a great deal of experience with mixed associations, where if one plots in all the data to the degree that you have, and I did, and I find I'm getting nothing out of it at all. At best, I might get something pertaining to direction of some stream flow or downslope migration of particles at some time in the past. And I know it's mixed anyway, so this is a minimal kind of information for the amount of time you expend plotting in distributions of artifacts. Yes.
I wonder if I could ask a very basic question. How do you know that these are mixed? What criteria
Where
do you have?
where
for-
criteria, everything from unworn, fresh material to rolled, worn, heavily worn material. Stratigraphically, there's actually horizons merge, come together.
Okay.
It seems to me that just, let's take Art's material from Taboon. You could not do what he is doing at Taboon in an open site, I don't think.
It depends on the site. I don't see any reason why you couldn't.
Well, you certainly did, DeLumley did exactly that at Terra Mata, which, by the way, is not a cave, but an open site. At Lazare, he did a salvage job in a piece of the cave which had been chopped away at by Commandant Octobon. And he did a interesting piece of excavation, because these people are taught to do that. In France, you either do that or you don't dig anything at all. And it's a rather nice change of tradition, I would say. But you might also look and see what he tried to reconstruct out of what he dug. And, you know, his reconstruction doesn't always jive with what he found.
And
You know, he has a rather extensive imagination. I don't take any of it away from him. He's a brilliant young guy. But he does have some flights of fancy, you know. Just, you know, there's steps in between here of deduction, you know, and extrapolation that you don't want to forget. Right?
The important thing is that the way he excavated it,
Right.
you then
put it
can
back.
question this
Yeah,
interpretation.
sure can. That's
because
But he
the data
does,
is-
he
is
does
all
not,
there.
however, in fact, publish data that give you the confidence that he had more than used geological levels as much as 20 and 30 centimeters thick and lumped them all as one floor plan. And that I consider
Yes, there is.
rather a thing that boggles my mind, considering that this is frost-weathered debris, and this is all supposed to be one seasonal occupation of 6 months. And my retort to that is, if you do that sort of thing, it's like saying that they use dynamite to blast the ceiling off to get that stuff down there in 5 months. You know, some of these things sound better than they really are when you look at them closely.
Yeah, does this all boil down to one site equals one field strategy? One can't really generalize about field strategies. There are a limited number of things you can do with any site, and you have to choose when you're faced with the actual situation what you're going to do.
Well, all of us have different goals when we're doing prehistory, and naturally these strategies are going to reflect these goals. But part of the things that maybe I would want to emphasize, that if one of our goals is the definition of the sorts of things that we're calling industries here, then some sort of an approach along the line of what we call area archaeology seems indicated.
But what else would you have done in this situation?
Well, I wouldn't have done, looking back, there are lots of things I'd have done differently, but not that.
Yeah, it seems to me that it's all laid out for you. That's what there is to do, so you do it.
No,
I just can't think of anything else.
There were
to
some
do.
other possibilities. That would have been to have chosen the 10, that seemed to be the 10 best sites, and have spent 4 or 5 months on each site, which would be a more traditional way of doing it. Many of the sites we dealt with would normally be passed up by archaeologists, certainly in the Near East, as not being worth looking at. It's not a cave if you don't have elephants coming out of it. It's not worth your time. And I think we would have lost a lot of data in terms of settlement pattern, distribution, reinforcing of homogeneity between groups of assemblages. We would have had much less to work on.
Yes and no, but I think there's some special things that you have to bear in mind with reference to the kind of work that you people in particular did in the Nile. First, you have to think of what the Nile is, and second, you have to remember that much of it's going to be lost in some areas, okay? And the third is that you come to it, in fact, from the New World, where you had a big area that was, quote, yours, you know? Nobody gave you 2 sites to work. It was yours. You could do whatever you want. This happens to hardly any of us anytime. Really uncommonly rare, you know. He doesn't have a concession for the whole of Mount Carmel and all the way over to Galilee or something like that, and the world isn't sliced up that way. So that's very important. You also have blocked funds, which is absolutely critical. Most of us have to work in a different sort of way. You have to justify every penny for every specific purpose. And if you have a sort of reservoir that you can tap in a different way, that makes a huge difference, I think. But most of all, you came to it from the New World, where this sort of settlement, aerial kind of archaeology is, was generated.
Now, that, I think the
That's
last
very
is-
important.
I think the last is the critical one.
Yeah, I think it's very important.
I wouldn't, I would say, there was no difference in the funding on those projects that were done with dollars and those that were done with block funds. That is, as far as the proposals. So we can say that really wasn't it. We get concessions in other areas that are not in salvage because we ask for them that way. We don't ask for Mount Carmel site, you see, or the site. We ask for this area. And therefore, we don't, our research design, you see, is quite different. And I would agree that probably there's some parts of the world where we wouldn't get this kind of cooperation from government authorities.
I think
But,
most places.
But we do in Israel.
Yeah, but you do
With
in
some
only certain
difficulty.
parts of Israel where nobody else has either largely been or wants to go.
Yes.
Yes, that's true, that's true. My point would be asking, is there not a possibility that we could begin to do these kinds of things, though, in those areas like in Africa? You're doing the same sort of thing in the Omo.
I am, in fact, on a different sort of scale.
Isn't there a possibility we begin to do these things? This is a valuable approach, that we begin to do these things in other areas.
Sure.
Begin an educational effort among those other prehistorians, so that concessions of this type would be more readily available.
Well, they certainly are available in East Africa. We had
That's
the
what
Nakuru
you're-
Naivasha Basin. In fact, we only did operate about 1/10 of it in the event because that kept us busy for 8 months. But we were doing a survey and then excavating selected sites. We did move into the option that Tony was talking about. That is, we did end up by spending 7 months and most of our man-hours on one extremely rich hunting site with fantastic bone midden, and we were wanting to get comparative material for the early hunting sites in East Africa, and there just aren't any shortcuts. It's just a long business. We didn't finish excavating the site either. We haven't got the whole structure of it. So there are times when, I mean, this is an act of choice. We could have just left it at the soundings, and we already had sort of 10,000 trimmed tools. There was no problem with just the artifact sample. We already had that long before the 6 months was up, well, after 2 weeks. But if we wanted to find out how big it was, how many people there were, what animals they killed, what the hunting pattern was, and so on, then it was you were going to have to opt for a long, slow excavation.
I have a question in this regard then. How much of this site do you intend to excavate in order to, are you going to take the whole site or just a sample of the site? And if you are taking a sample of the site, what limits do you place on this? When do you consider that you have a sample is what I'm trying to say.
Well, as I say, we weren't trying to sample it, we were trying to map it,
The entire
to explore its extent. It turned out that there was probably several similar middens, each with their own site area in the same general area, and we certainly weren't planning to do more than one of them. But yeah, otherwise I would have time permitting, we would have excavated large areas of it, leaving only witness sections. Because if you're interested in a total plan of a settlement, and I'm not talking about a multi-house settlement, then well, you really have to dig enough to see the plan. And you have to trust that there are other comparable sites, that this is not utterly unique in the sense that it's the only one of its kind that ever existed and was ever preserved.
Well, you said there were others in the...
Well, there
same
appeared to
area.
be. We sounding out from one we were actually working on, some of the soundings hit similar, just piled up masses of bone. We didn't explore them.
So you don't know if there was actually different bone there than there were in this other one?
Well, we know there were gaps. I mean, there were between separating them from us, there were areas with nothing.
I would think that if you're going to do archaeological research in the countries in sub-Saharan Africa, you've more or less got to have some kind of a survey permit, because in most places, with the exception of perhaps certain parts of South Africa and Rhodesia, the sites, one doesn't know where the material is. You've got to look for it, you've got to find it, first of all. Those sites which are quite clearly going to yield a lot of information as a result of some prior trial excavations in the past, are few and far between, really, when you add them up. So that it's absolutely essential to have the survey, first of all. And most governments, I think, are quite ready to agree to that I know of. Possibly South Africa is an exception, and Rhodesia in this connection. But,
Which,
about survey
exception which
permission.
way?
about permission to operate in a wide area.
It's never been tested before, and I'd be frankly very, very surprised if they didn't permit concessions of the design which we've been talking about. No one has ever been in ours for not a site but an area.
I think concession's a bad word. It has all sorts of
Yes,
mining
yes.
exclusivism.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well,
it was
South
okay in
Nile was-
the context of Nubia because it was operating like that. But
Well, there are certainly some areas that come to mind where this would be appropriate. For example, the northern Transvaal would be ideal for this, with all the Donga sites that have been recorded, and there must be jillions more. And one could really do something here.
Yeah.
And that would be very interesting in terms of trying to tackle the Petersburg MSA business there.
The same
But there's some
goes for
areas, I
just
think, where
about
this
any
is really not, it won't work, you know. Or it works on a different sort of level, and I think that what Glenn was talking about is the same kind of distributional archaeology, I suppose, that everyone would like to do if it was possible. You know, you make every effort to do this. In the case of our work in Spain, we did distributional archaeology and got to have 2 sites. Well, when you're working, whatever it is, 400,000 years ago or 300, whatever you like for a date, and if we enlarged our sample by 100% by finding another site, then we still only have 2. And one was butchered halfway before we ever went there. You have to bear this in mind also. You could take the Bezer or something and work a certain part of it. Well, you could do that, except that there's a lot of vested interest there. And people aren't going to give these things away. You could take other places where people aren't working, in Yugoslavia perhaps, or isolated parts of Hungary where no one happens to have been because of roads. Parts of southern Germany would be ideal that I happen to know. And if there are no other archaeologists around, chances are very, very good that you could be permitted and encouraged to do this. But if there are other people around, they are not going to like this thing at all. You're working in their backyard, and the worst thing you're doing is you're working the way they'd like to work if they had the money and the personnel, et cetera, to do it. And that's a very sticky wicket. Very bad.
It's a very real.
What
it's a
about
very real
what about the possibility? I know it's been done in Egypt. Braidwood, in a sense, was doing this in Turkey, of including local archaeologists and other scholars.
You didn't include it, they included him, or he wouldn't have
Well,
gone
you
there.
know,
He still hasn't been able to go there. And Frank's the best one, or Phil, both, to talk about this, because my understanding is that you can, well, I'll overstate the case, then you correct me. You gain authorization to work in a certain area for survey purposes, period, let's say. You may or may not, with that, get authorization to test a site, period. Then you get authorization to work in detail a site, okay? And then you have to worry about, do I or do I not get the material out so I can study it? It's another sort of thing.
In Israel, I think you have a situation where it's exactly the same thing, but almost by definition, because the emphasis on classical archaeology, what we would consider a rather large-scale excavation of a Paleolithic site, with the exception of a cave, which is viewed differently, they would put under testing. If I wasn't going to open a site completely, they wouldn't call it excavation. It just comes out.
Well, this is in part a convenience also, because the whole Board of Antiquities has to approve any particular excavation, so it's much easier for the department to say, well, you can test these sites, because Birant can give you authorization to test the sites. But if you're going to get authorization to, so it's rather a more complicated administrative problem too there. It isn't, I don't think.
Well, in Sudan, we had the same thing. We never had an excavation permit. We had a permit to survey and to test.
Yeah, that's what we have in Sudan. And they're aware of the Antiquities Department's aware of the incongruities of the situation. In fact, they come out every now and then and mosey around these trenches that we've put in, and this is a pretty good sized test, you know. But,
2 kilometers of trenches.
yeah.
That's a good size
So,
test.
you know, if we did dig 2 kilometers of trenches in the Fayum, we have Ferris. They have some cause for being concerned, but
Geological testing.
yes.
Much depends, I think, on what kind of what sort of period sites that they are short eating with. If you're dealing with the Paleolithic and flints in inverted commas, there's not quite the same emphasis, certainly that is my experience in Syria, as there is if you want to work on ceramic sites, for example. And we were given a permit to operate in the Middle Orontes, a survey permit, which unfortunately we weren't able to take up because the war came along and they squashed the whole thing. But they were fully cooperative where it came to Paleolithic material, because it was starting to fill the museum up in Damascus.
Do you have this much, you have to get a survey permit, and then come back and get a testing permit?
Well, the situation varies now. Last year I had a permit to do survey and testing, and that's been sort of typical. A test is defined as something that doesn't take more than, what was it, 3 days, 2 days or something. And if you do want to, and that was unlimited testing, any site. But if you want to dig, then you have to ask specifically for permission. And a dig then, according to the rules that they have had when I left, was it had to be more than, was it 2 months, Bill? 3 months?
Now 6 weeks.
Well, it was shorter than, while you were there than it was when I was there. But in any case, they have different definitions for what constitutes an excavation. And it's not the area, it's the duration.
Anything
how much
between
you
3
open up?
days.
If it takes you, if it took you 3 months to dig a 1 meter square, 10 centimeters, that would constitute an excavation. Whereas if you quarried a whole site in 2 days, that was a test.
Did you have a man with you at times?
Well, theoretically there was. If he chose to come along, he was there. But this sort of, I would like to make one point, that is that area archaeology has been followed for 40 years anyway in this region. And one might quarrel with some of the surveys that were done 30 or 40 years ago, but nevertheless, there were systematic attempts to cover whole areas, specifically for the purpose of finding sites to dig, usually. But in any case, there are lots and lots of surveys done.
Can I hark back to, really to the Nubian material and ask some questions? I was specifying how long it had taken us to dig one selected site for particular purposes. Got the impression that on account of smaller amounts of overburden, perhaps it's looser and stuff we had to disengage our material from, and some of your sites, of course, are surface sites. How can we get some comments from you on how you feel about the kind of site structure data that you've got in these comparatively superficial circumstances? How satisfactory you feel that aspect of the study was?
You mean internal site structure?
Yeah.
It varied with the archaeologists, I think, a good deal. Tony, you spent 3 months, wasn't it, in the Formosa?
About that. In certain of the Cormusan sites, for instance, I think it's fairly good. These sites were extremely long, hundreds of meters in length, and I could not have excavated, Toto, in the whole 19 months I spent in Nubia. But I put, I would say, about a third of my time in on those sites and the Halton sites. In other areas, it was much weaker, particularly where there were situations of partial depletion, where some material was left in situ, but not much. Then the judgment was that we would deal with the material not in any strict mapping, but in terms of small arbitrary units, 1 square meter units, for instance, which then could be checked in the laboratory, and that took much less time. There's situations, analogous situations in Israel, where the density of concentration is such that you could not map all artifacts. You would need pieces of paper the size of this table to map a 1 square meter unit, just from the number of artifacts that are present. And those, I think, we move up to something around a 1 square meter unit to test horizontal variability in that way.
My question partly though is given these circumstances, how much do you feel that you're finding out and how much do you feel you're missing in terms of the internal evidence from pattern and arrangement of what was going on by how many people for how long?
Shimoleski and Shield spent 80% of 2 field seasons, long field seasons, on this problem of what many people might have called a site, which turned out to be a series of site clusters. And I think they documented it with their scatter pattern work, but they spent a lot of time collecting these sites and excavating them and placing them in this stratigraphy.
I think some of us in Africa are a little bit suspicious of sites that are quite close to the surface. Perhaps this is not true in Nubia. Some places one has a very active soil fauna that rather create floors, in quotes. In sandy areas, of course, we're all familiar with situations where by sand blowing out will allow perhaps several occupations to settle onto one. What kind of confidence do you feel that some of your material, in fact, aren't agglomerations of that kind rather than representing perhaps a single occupation, if that was what your interpretation was?
The repetitiveness of it.
In a number of cases, we detected this. We found that quite different assemblages had settled. In these cases, frequently you could see it by walking across. The presence of the radiators again, mixed with something else that was totally obvious.
We would check this by feature units across the site. And if there was any kind of significant variability across the site, one would have to look very closely at it. And this could be checked actually as the material came in. And there were situations, particularly Ikhtiaria, where we had a slope with a whole series of sites where we did spend a fair amount of time making a surface collection, which was mixed. It was mixed with 3 units. It took a lot of excavation there, but we were finally able to isolate all 3 units in situ.
There's 3 field projects there before we got it smoothed out to anywhere like our satisfaction. As we made the first thing, we didn't realize we had mixture. It was the first season. And we dug trenches and did collecting, and then when we got it back in the lab and looked at it, it really was, there seemed to be something that was different. There were 2 things that we find in other places separately were combined there that suggested that we might be dealing with something mixed. Went back and looked at it and detected that there really were, and we isolated these 2 things. And then we found again that there was something in there in a specialized area. Went back a 3rd time.
Finally, the last season, we found the place where it was still all intact, stratigraphic.
Play the devil's advocate for a moment. What if someone were to maintain that one used quite different kinds of artifacts, difference in the way we've been talking about some of these microlithic collections that we've been looking at here, that one used quite different ones for different kinds of activities, so that you're, in terms of the Berg-Bartenstein terminology, perhaps you had facies of one phase.
What we were after there was to find out if that really did exist, or if what we were trying, what it was, were 3 occupations separated in time. And this partly is because we were stumbling around in a new a new field situation in which we had no familiarity. But if we'd gone back to that site in our final season, we would never have had that kind of problem. But by recognizing that these different things that we had found other places were occurring together in this one locality, it caused us to re-examine the stratigraphic evidence that we had, and we had dug part of the site. We went then and looked in other parts of the sites and determined that all three of these things really did exist in situ in different stratigraphic units. But we wouldn't have found that had we been content with our first sample or a second sample.
I think if we had just worked that site, we would have had very great difficulty in recognizing the mixture.
This is really the problem of the cave that you were talking about.
The larger the sample, if this had recurred at 5 or 6 or 7 different sites in the same proportions in the same way, then we would have had some fairly strong evidence that it was not mixture, but it was a variability we didn't expect. But because of the number of sites, this one stood out as being unique and never showed repetition. And therefore, we had to look at it more closely.
This is an aspect of surface survey work which I don't think can be ignored, that one can never look at one site, and one doesn't ever look at one site in its own right. One is only observing it in relation to everything else that you know about other sites around it. And I don't think it is even intuition, it's just plain rational observation that makes you isolate these things. Could I throw out a few suggestions about other processes for assessing the value of either surface material or material which is only lightly covered? We found it valuable to actually plot very dense surface scatters with the aid of rigid metal grids. Very simple, very quick. Simply throw down a large grid of 1 foot squares and have the labourers go in with marked paper packets and simply pick up everything within that 1 foot square. You can then go back to the laboratory and reconstruct the content of each square foot of the scatter. You can either take the whole scatter or a piece of it which you select, and then simply take isolated counts and do Poisson tests on the distribution to find out whether they are truly random scatters or not. And if you have got artificial clusters in these things, you're going to locate them, you're going to isolate them. And this is a legitimate procedure for establishing whether you have apparent or interesting clusters at all. The same thing can be
where there weren't high Poisson values?
Yes.
Yeah, what kind of site would have a random distribution?
Yeah, I can show you two, actually. They took a long time to do. Where if you took just one thing, a core or a certain scraper or something like this, this thing would simply throw out completely even distributions which you could pick out by eye anyway, even before you started testing. And again, there were other kinds which simply gave very high clusters, in fact piles of specific items.
Can you find things in scatter patterns you can't find by looking at it from the surface, walking across it?
Oh yes, good heavens, yes. Certain concentrations of certain tool types, and the stuff is so dense you simply can't pick it up.
In fact, I think the scatter pattern is your only ultimate test of whether this material has been disturbed or deflated or not, whether your pieces fit together to certain objects. If it's been deflated, they will have been scattered.
My experience with it, though, is that usually the scatter pattern confirms what I've already seen.
You must have wonderful eyes for it.
I would say that it does if you plot the distribution of everything on your grid, which is what we did in the Sahara. As you're plotting it, you're noting what it is, and you get and that you form an overall opinion of what is there. Certainly, undoubtedly, does come out when you look at the plotted pattern itself. But basically, I would think that you do get a good idea as to whether there really are significant clusters.
It's the same effect as an aerial photograph. It's giving you a comprehensive view of a very large thing which you can't see when you're standing on the site because you have only oblique view.
There are two types of scatter patterns. Garth and I are talking about the one where we would locate the presence of this particular chip in this particular flake. The other type, you'd record the presence of a core here and a tool here and so forth. With the second type, you don't get quite the same information.
Well, this scatter pattern over here that Tony has, Scott was showing us the other day, these are the sorts of things that made me stop and think if I didn't miss some data in some of our sites that we did not collect by scatter pattern. Some very tight, compact localities, 15, 20 meters in diameter, could well have been, no, yours 12 and 13 are too large for that, but that we did not pick up in a scatter pattern manner. They were everything in a very small area. And I've, since seeing these, I've wondered if it would not have been if we'd not been better advised to have used it for even in those instances where.
Well, I wonder, I remember in the field we had some discussion about this at the Fakori sites, how much utility there is in doing this with a site that you can see has undergone extensive deflation. Whether or not it's not a priori just a waste of energy.
Could I say something to that? This is a perfectly legitimate gripe. When you have pre-knowledge that the scatters that you're going to plot are going to be meaningless, it's, I think, just a matter of courtesy to the other unfortunates who are going to have to read your field work to be able to demonstrate for a limited area that this is in fact so.
Yeah,
Just simply tell them what you did. I found this bum site, and just to show you that it's a bum site, here's a little patch which I plotted, and look, it's bum. This constitutes published evidence. Even though it's bad, it's still evidence that it is bad. And you won't have people coming, sort of sticking pins into you afterwards saying, well, you can't show us that it's bad.
Only into wax models of it.
Could I do that anyway?
Could I bring something up in line with doing distribution patterns of a site's surface? I think it perhaps is an appropriate time to start a discussion of sampling procedures.
Yes, let's.
Which are as far as I can see, the most important aspect of this sort of an endeavor. And I'll just throw out something that I started to discuss with Glenn last night. I've been told, and I'm not sure that I fully understand why, that one cannot use the sort of statistical tests that, for instance, Binford was attempting to use on the Mousterian Loala facies without having total proveniences for every artifact in the sample.
Yeah.
And I don't quite follow it, and I think it's an interesting, perhaps, point at which to start the problem of sampling. In fact, is this...
Provenience is relative, isn't it?
Is it? In an in situ site?
Certainly never absolute.
It's not absolute.
Maybe somewhere
no.
between these two.
Well, what you're looking at is the relationship between artifacts in context, not their position.
How are you going to use this information in the kinds of analyses that he did?
Well, you can't use them in the kind of analyses he did in that particular article. The question is, since there does seem to be an emphasis on trying to check randomness or non-randomness and various other patterns with statistical techniques, there must be checks on it. I mean, for instance, there's the whole problem of in sampling procedures, can you use parametric statistical tests to check things that don't fulfill the conditions of parametric statistics? That was one of my, I sort of thought for a minute when you were talking about a Poisson test, if in fact you aren't, in some sense, exceeding the boundaries of the test by not postulating before you use it that you are fulfilling its conditions, as it is a parametric test.
I wonder if Garth, could you explain what in fact you are testing here with your scatter pattern? I'm not quite sure what it is you're testing.
We're trying to seek close clustering of individual types, Frank, within on the surface, which might have been the result of human activity.
But was your test only on one particular?
Yes, I would take one or two. I would take one or two tool types and plot them, say, end scrapers, and then simply do a count per square foot of end scrape, and then, well, the usual procedure.
But
for
this obviously
and you're
doesn't.
testing. You're testing then to see whether or not this distribution is random or not.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, to
But
say you have
that's all,
100
that's all.
square feet, sorry, 10
Yes.
square feet and 100 pieces, then the expectation is 10 per square foot.
Yeah.
And if one square has 50, then the Poisson distribution will show that this is unexpected.
But obviously, if a cluster diagram, as we see up there, I can't tell what those clusters are from there, happen to be, say, Levallois flakes, and you happen to have a random distribution of scrapers, you certainly haven't demonstrated a random distribution of material on the site.
Okay, well, so we found that for scrapers, and we
You
move
do
on
the
to
same
next
thing for
type.
every category
Yes,
that you found
yes,
there.
Yeah. I'll cheerfully admit all the limitations of isolating types. Obviously, the logical fault right in the beginning of this. But it's an elementary and useful test as a piece of formal presentation of data. It's helpful.
And then do you put it all together, kind of thing? Like if you've done end scrapers, cores,
Would be nice,
try
wouldn't
to?
it?
Yeah.
For a surface site, I'm just not prepared to take that much effort, quite honestly.
Can you see any way of determining the optimal sample for taking at the site?
Yeah, this is the universal problem. No, I'm afraid I can't. I've quoted something the other day, the bigger the better. I simply wouldn't like to put absolute values on it. You've got to weigh up so many different things. The problem in hand, very practical problems like how much time are you spending on it, what else have you got to do today, how much labour have you got with you at the time, all these things play a part in it.
Because it was Tony and Fickery and I and Jim all discovered in the lab that we could get quite adequate data on our debitage using a very small fraction of the total.
I believe Tixier has been saying this for years.
Of course, the problem is could you effect that sampling procedure in the field, thereby, considerably shortening the amount of expenditure and effort on each site. I don't think it can be done. I see no way to do it.
David, what's worrying about that is when you have a very big scatter, like we've heard, some absolutely colossal aerial distributions for scatters. When you get to it, you are facing a new, an unknown animal, and you don't know how it behaves yet. And if you go and you just take up 100 specimens, because you know that's a useful sample in the lab, one doesn't know that it's the same sort that's going on.
You can't do that at all, because that's the whole problem of bulk sampling versus hand-pick samples that you get in paleoecological studies. It can't be done.
Well, I'm sure most people would tackle this problem in the same way. They would take small total samples from various patches on this huge spread, which they knew that they couldn't take home to the lab because you need a convoy of 3-ton trucks to do it or something like this. And you take those little bits back to the lab and analyse them down, and if there are differences, well, you might get interested and return to the site. One just has to play it by ear as you go along.
No, we found this in two different situations in the Negev. One at a site where we certainly expected different concentrations of artifacts. There seemed to be 2 tent rings, there are areas of grinding stones. The very initial results suggest that there aren't, that the types and cores and debitage are scattered rather evenly. At another site, this huge site,